So I just finished watching Grace Randolph's video on looking at how critics and fans are biased to the DCEU films. They have a bias against or a bias for. And she was talking about some pretty interesting things, which I thought were pretty good. She was talking about the industry's coverage and so on. But there are just one or two points I wanted to just correct Grace Randolph on from her video. And I actually left the points here in my comments. But one of the things that Grace Randolph said in her video was that Batman v Superman is a team movie like the Avengers. There are a couple of things that are just wrong about that. Okay, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice is not a team movie. All right, it is a movie that pits Batman against Superman. Wonder Woman cameos in there, and you see a very brief cameo of the Justice League to be, but this is not a team movie. The other point is she's comparing Batman v Superman to team movies like Captain America: Civil War, Avengers: Age of Ultron, Avengers, and that's a huge mistake to make because one, it's not an ensemble film. Okay, Justice League that's coming out, that's going to be the ensemble film. And second of all is the point that Batman v Superman is a sequel to Man of Steel, no doubt about that. But if you're going to compare Batman v Superman to an MCU film, you at least need to compare it at the same time or the same type of movie. All right? And in this case, you cannot compare it to an ensemble movie. It has, if you can find a versus movie in the MCU that does not have an ensemble cast, but with recognizable characters like the Batman equivalent is Iron Man, the Superman equivalent is Captain America, then you can compare it. If there's no film like that, then you have to look at the second MCU film. Okay? The very first MCU film was Iron Man. And the second MCU film was The Incredible Hulk. And we all know that BVS has done much better than The Incredible Hulk, okay? So my point to Grace Randolph is you cannot be comparing movies arbitrarily, okay? Her point is that Batman v Superman underperformed because it didn't make $1 billion. Whereas there are a lot of films that came out recently that made $1 billion. But if Grace Randolph is being honest with herself, most of those films that make $1 billion are animation films. And we only have a handful of MCU sequel films which have made $1 billion. Okay? The other franchises which have crossed $1 billion are Avatar, which is not really a comic book movie, and we also had the Star Wars franchises which did that. Okay? So all those franchises have a huge fan base which is built up over time. The only thing that BVS had before it was Man of Steel. That's all they had. Okay? And that was the first introduction movie. When you look at the first Iron Man film, 585 million. Man of Steel, 668 million. Some people say, well, Superman's a famous figure. Well, if that was the case, that Superman and Batman are famous figures, why did Batman and Robin become a box office flop? And why did Superman Returns, a carbon copy of the successful Donner movie Superman, be a box office flop? So it's not just that these are iconic characters, okay? In fact, I would argue that Zack Snyder had a harder task because the last view of that iconic character was a bitter one, and people had a bitter taste about Superman in their mouths. So the reboot had to be successful. Iron Man didn't have that history. Iron Man, what attracts everybody to Iron Man is the same thing that attracts everybody to Transformers. It's his ability to transform into this metallic looking man that has all these gadgets. That's what people are fascinated by. That's what people can't get enough of Iron Man for. That's why Iron Man 3 made so much money, because they basically did what Michael Bay did with Transformers and exploited a commodity that had become something that was in demand for the public. But nobody says anything about Iron Man. No, everybody talks about Michael Bay. Oh, Michael Bay. Oh, look what he's doing. Those movies are garbage. When in fact, if you go and review Michael Bay's movies, you will find that Michael Bay actually has better story than Iron Man 3 in all of his Transformer movies. And to Michael Bay's credit, at least he stays with the comic versions of these movies. They don't just create whole new stories, right? Optimus Prime is the center of the Transformers. And I've been watching some Transformers movies. I listened to a gentleman who really kind of set me straight. And you're right. The Transformers movie does have story in them. A lot of explosions. There's a lot of collateral damage that nobody accounts for. But there's a lot of story. Same thing with Iron Man 3. Even Iron Man 2, its story's kind of flimsy as well. So, I mean, anyway. But my point to Grace Randolph is she's wrong about that. And the other point is, in terms of underperforming, she decided to pull back Batman 1989 and Superman 1978. And she's showing that those movies, when you bear into consideration inflation for tickets, they would make over $1 billion. And that's kind of like saying that Civil War underperformed because Avengers made more money than it. Made basically, I think it's 3 million more than it. 300 million more than it, or 400 million more than it. And that Avengers Age of Ultron made, again, 3 to 4 times more than it. It's the same ensemble cast. So she would be saying, therefore, that Civil War underperformed, and that's not true at all. No one says that Civil War underperformed, okay? And my point being, you cannot use that. And you're talking about movies that are like 20-something years back. You're talking about movies that are like 40-something years back. You're talking about Superman in a time when they never had superhero movies. This first superhero movie comes out, okay? Then you're talking about Batman 1989, where nobody thought of Batman on the screen, never saw Batman on the screen in this kind of menacing way, okay? So and there wasn't a whole lot of comic book movies back then as well. So it's really unfair for her to use that. That's kind of like saying, okay, if Star Wars doesn't make Avatar's money, then it underperformed. That's ridiculous. Okay? For the franchise, Superman is the highest grossing, I'm talking about Man of Steel, is the highest grossing Superman movie of all time. We don't talk about inflation. You know why? That's a hypothetical. If you're going to change the ticket sale prices, then you have to move that Superman, this Superman that she's talking about here in our argument, you have to move that all the way up into our era. And it will not survive. It will not survive as a movie in this era. It won't even make $100 million, I guarantee you. So if you're going to go with those hypotheticals, right, in your argument, then you're obviously going to have to bring other factors into the equation, because you have to look at the time when these things happened. It's the first time people seeing a man flying in the sky and all of that. So that sort of, as we say, novelty, this is what these guys feed off of. Novelties is what these guys go with. Batman v Superman was not a novelty film. It was a film based on story and plot. And it just so happened these were superheroes. Same thing with Suicide Squad. It was based on the characters and also the humanity of the characters. So I disagree with Grace Randolph 100% in her arguments that these two movies underperformed. And she's going with the media again in that regard. She's trying to make a compromise. And I disagree. Do I think that Suicide Squad had flaws in it? I pointed out it had flaws. I talked about how Enchantress had these guards that never did anything in the final fight scene. And they were there. You know, there's some blatant flaws in those movies. But that's like all movies. That's my point. I'm not saying that these movies are the greatest movies of all time. I'm not going to go to that extreme. Okay, especially Suicide Squad. I do agree Batman v Superman Ultimate Cut is a masterpiece, and I believe it is the greatest comic book movie of all time because it deals with humanity and issues of humanity. But having said that, all right, because it overtook Watchmen in my opinion. Having said that, I want Grace Randolph to understand that the fans have a great point and they're reacting to the critics, and they deserve to react to the critics. And I've been debating a lot of people online because of that. And again, Grace is going by the argument these films need to make $1 billion to be successful, or they need to, that's how they will perform to their optimal. I disagree with that, right? And I'm not the only person. The other person who Grace Randolph actually attacked once, which is he's from Collider Videos. If I remember his name right now, that would be good. He says greetings and salutations. He also agreed that people have unrealistic expectations about Suicide Squad, and if it doesn't make $1 billion, they're going to say it underperformed. And true to form, the Marvel tards, they want to say it underperformed. Again, I call them Marvel tards because they're not people who are willing to entertain anything other than Marvel as a good film. All right, I know Grace Randolph is trying to be in the middle ground, and he's trying to say that she's objective and she's even keeled. But in her attempts to do so, I think she is actually, again, sabotaging these movies. Okay, because 872 million worldwide is not an underachievement for Warner Brothers. And they've grossed over $1 billion worldwide in the other stuff, in the DVDs and it's still the number one selling DVD and so on in the world, or at least in the top three. And then you have Suicide Squad, which is it's overachieved, because I think a lot of people, including Grace Randolph, didn't think it was going to make that kind of money. And she was actually a detractor to the film, and she's a DC fan, yes, but she was a detractor to the film in this case, because Grace Randolph, she just has a certain taste in movies. And I'm not mad at Grace, okay? But I just wanted to correct her on those things because I think she was wrong about them. You guys have a great one.